Back in the day, in a time where men still called on the old gods to aid them in their need, the King of Ireland, no, I just got so distracted, sorry. Let's start again. Back in the day, gods were there. The King of the world set out to invade Ireland. He filled his ships with his armies, his weaponry, and his only daughter. And together they set sail, heading from Europe to the west coast of Ireland. They landed in a place called Ventry, and when they stepped onto the land, they were met by the armies of the great Irish warrior, Cuchulainn. Now, the King of the world thought that this would be an easy conquest, but it turned out their armies were well matched. And so they fought day after day, a great bloody battle. And day after day, out on the ships, his daughter, Mish, waited. She waited to hear news of their winnings. She waited for her father to return. She waited to go home, to be taken home. But days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months, and though Mish prayed to the moon every single night to be returned to her homeland, the battle raged on. Until, after a year and a day, Cuchulainn had called upon his ancestors' gods, and they had given him powers where he met with the King of the world, and they fought, and he raised his great sword, and he cut off his head. The King of the world was dead. The sounds rose across the waters from the shore to the ship, the ululations of the winning side parading home in glory. The death throes cried out across the waves of the people who were dying. And the caws of the ravens and the crows, those birds of the Morrigan, heard of the death watch of warriors dying, as they cruised over, pecking for scraps and cleaning up the bones. And when all was quiet, Mish came ashore, and she wandered through the debris and the blood and the guts and all of that outpouring of war, until she found her father's body, lifeless. She recognised him only from the glinting of his armour, and she fell upon that headless body, tugging and pulling and clawing, licking at his wounds, sucking at his wounds until something in her snapped. And she let out a howl as shrill as a winter gale, and then she ran deep into the mountains, and she was lost from civilization. When she reached that rocky place, her grief and her rage transformed her. She sprouted feathers and talons, claws, her teeth sharpened and long down her face. She sprouted spikes across her back. She ran faster than any living thing in those mountains, and she hunted what lived there. Some said she could even fly, and she preyed upon any man or woman who tried to pass through that place. All were ripped to pieces and never heard from again. And so it was the people of that land, they moved further and further from that forested edge of those mountains to make some distance between them and this beast, this monster that roamed in the mountains. And the kings at that time, well, they were warrior kings, and they sent all their finest young warriors off to the mountains to try to kill this beast. But almost none returned. And those who did came back months later, and they were haunted and lost to this world. And time passed, many years, some say 300 years, until that time of warriors was in the past. And there came a new king, a king with a warmer heart, perhaps. And he was concerned about these tales of this monster that meant no one could pass through these forests, no one could pass through these mountains, they were cut off from other communities. And he decided to try and solve this issue. And so he summoned the oldest storyteller in the land. And when she came, she was the only one who remembered the true tale of Mish and what had befallen her. So hearing this story, the king sent out word. He wanted somebody who could bring her in alive. And so he promised his daughter in marriage to whichever warrior might succeed in his task. Land and fortune would be theirs. But again the same thing happened. The young Bolshi warriors, they went off all proud and shining, but they did not return. Or those who did came back mad or mute. Until finally the king had almost lost hope for this project of his. When one day a young poet called Dovrush came and he said to the king, I would like to go and try to bring in Mish. Would you give me some gold coins to carry with me? The king looked at this young lad. He was pretty, handsome, and played beautifully. He had a way with words, but he was no fighter. He was no warrior, no strategist. He said, I do not think you will return, lad. But Dovrush was insistent, and so he said, sure, take coins, take whatever you want, but on your head be it. And so Dovrush packed his bag. He put in the gold and a pot and some food, and he took his harp and he took his dogs, and together they walked into that forest at the edge of the mountains. Well, he hadn't been walking long before he felt the presence of something watching him, something following, something stalking him. But he did not look round, he did not sway from his task, he did not show fear. He walked on until he came through the forests and he arrived at a place where he was in a clearing in the middle of the mountains. Up ahead he could see the peaks poking up towards the clouds. Around him the forest crowded to the edge of this clearing, and a river flowed through the middle of it. When he arrived, he took off his cloak and he lay it on the floor. Then he scattered the gold coins along the edge of his cloak, and he took his harp and he sat down on the cloak and he began to play. And as any musician knows, there's a power in music, and he knew how to lure, how to conjure. And he could feel that she was near now, but he needed to bring her closer, and so he played. Now the music rising, now slowing to a gentle melody, until finally he felt her arrive. He looked up from his playing, and there at the edge of the clearing he saw her lurking in the shadows of the trees. Matted hair filled with sticks and leaves, face muddied, bloodied, fur where skin should be, talons where fingers should be, feathers and spines poked from her as she crouched. The Dovrush kept playing, and gently he muttered to his dogs, "Go, make her welcome." Quietly, his dogs got to their feet, and they padded over towards that shadowy figure. They knew their master's bidding, and so they put on their best smiles, and they wagged their tails, and they approached the beast. At that, Dovrush saw her flinch, so he called out and he said, "Oh, hi there. Don't worry, they're friendly." He saw Mish raise a taloned hand towards the dog's head. He saw her eyes were glistening. And then she raised her eyes to look at him, and he lowered his gaze and he kept on playing. He played and he played, luring her all the time until he saw she was just ahead of him, at the periphery of his vision. And when he looked up now, he saw that her eyes had fallen to the gold coins he had scattered on his cloak. And as she stared at them, in a voice rasping and rusty with lack of use, she said, "What is that?" Dovrush said, "That is gold." "I remember gold. There was gold in my father's court." Dovrush kept playing. She raised his eyes to his harp. "What is that?" "This is a harp. I'm playing music." "I remember music. There was music in my mother's home." Dovrush kept playing. And he said, "What else do you remember?" "I remember dogs." And with that, Dovrush very quietly started to hum as he played. "I remember singing," she said. And when he looked now, she was staring straight at him. But he knew that she did not see him, but memories. And so he played on and on until his fingers were sore and aching and tired. And then very quietly, he brought his music to an end and he laid down his harp. "Don't stop," she said. "More." "I will play more," he said. "But now I'm hungry. I'm going to eat food. Would you like some?" And he began to take out of his bag butter and cheese and bread and a bit of sweet mead. But at that, Mish jumped to her feet in a sudden hurry and she rushed back into the forest and she was gone. Dovrush ate, and just as he began to think he had lost her, suddenly she reappeared at the edge of the forest, her mouth, her face blooded, and she was dragging a deer she had killed by ripping out its throat. She carried the deer to Dovrush and she threw it on the floor, and then using her talons she gouged open the belly and pulled out the innards and grabbed a slab of that red hot meat and began to eat it. Dovrush smiled at her. "Let me show you something," he said. And he took from his bag his flint and he started a fire. He put his pot on the fire and he cooked the meat and he fed Mish a hot meal. And then he took water from the river and he boiled it on the fire. And where the river ran across the smooth rocks, there was a small pool separated from the river, a pool carved by a pebble. And he poured that hot water into that pool. And very tenderly, very gently, he took Mish's hand and he led her to the pool. He bathed her. He soothed her. He used moss as a soft sponge to clean her. And he took off a tiny bit of the filth that covered her. And as he did so, a few of the feathers, a couple of the spines that were growing from her, they fell into the water. And when he was done bathing with her, he wrapped her in his cloak. Now she was tired, so she lay down upon the open ground to sleep, but he said, No, I'll build you a shelter. So he did. He bought wood and bits of rope and did some tricks and he built a shelter. And they took her inside, and that night as she slept, Dovrush held her. The next morning, he played for her. And day after day, Dovrush played his harp, and Mish remembered her old life, who she was, parts of herself. And then one day, Dovrush himself was taking a bath in the river, and he noticed Mish was sitting on the side, watching him. And as he came out of the river in his naked form, she stared at him and she said, I don't remember that. He said, would you like me to show you what it can do? And very gently, Dovrush took her by the hand and he held her to him. And very gently he kissed her on her third forehead, on her feathered neck, on her breasts, and tenderly they made love. and a few more of the feathers and the spines fell from her. Now it was early spring when Davrush had arrived, looking for Mish, and he spent many months in the forest with her, until it came to the end of summer and the mornings started to be cold when they woke, and then Mish remembered winter. And so one day she took Davrush by the hand and she said, "Will you lead me back to the world of people?" And together they went, with the dogs and the harp and the bag of tricks, all the way back down the mountains and to the kingdom that had sent Davrush out. When the king saw him back and alive, he cried, shed tears, and he ordered a great banquet in their honour, and he welcomed Mish at his table. And when the king offered wealth and riches to Davrush, when he offered his daughter, Davrush said, "I have all the treasure I need." And so the two of them took up living together. They were given a cottage by the king on the edge of that dark forest that bordered the mountains. They grew a vegetable garden. He played music. They had 4 children, and they lived in a happy and bustling home. But still, at night, when the moon was most full and most shining, it would beckon to Mish through the door of their cottage, and she would follow its call outside. And Davrush was wise enough to let her go. And for a night, maybe 2, she would disappear back up into her mountains. For don't we all have parts of ourselves that can only really be with the rocks and the rivers and the trees? And the two of them understood the importance of balance, of having one foot in the home, the world of the hearth, and the other in the world of the wild. For it's only in balance we can live our fullest lives. Thank you.